Now that the betting games are over, the world is going back to its daily routine, its head full of stars and sporting achievements, with a furious desire to hit the gym. But the show is far from over, and all eyes are now turning to the United States, where the next decisive global event for the future of the planet will be held. The Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris match, who left the shadow of Joe Biden to take his place. Why is this event decisive? Because even if they are not the only factors capable of triggering planetary chaos, the two presidential aspirants have very different opinions regarding the treatment of the major conflicts that are hitting our world and in which the United States is engaged. At a time when the American economic and financial domination is increasingly criticized and even fought, the future president will have to show skill to maintain his status and the stability of world peace. We're really going to have to watch out for the lapses. In our latitudes, we do not necessarily feel all the effects, but in total, our planet is shaken by 56 conflicts. I'm not going to go over them all, but know that in 2008, there were only 8 of them. Never since the Second World War had humanity shown so much hostility at the same time, even during the Cold War. The tension could rise abruptly after the results of the US election on November 5th. There is even already talk of a possible Third World War. In this video, I propose that you take a tour of the world of the main conflicts and see together what position the various camps that are clashing occupy at the moment I am talking to you, to see how it is evolving and where it will lead us. Overview. How is the world doing in the middle of summer 2024? Once is not customary, I will answer with an understatement. It's not terrible. Currently, the Economic Institute of Peace, which produces the Global Peace Index every year, lists 56 armed conflicts in 92 countries, an absolute record since its creation in 2008. There are those that are talked about a lot and that I will also talk about a lot, such as Ukraine, the Red Sea, or Gaza, in which the world superpowers are opposed, and those that go unnoticed, with more local repercussions, such as in Mali, Burma, Sudan, or Iraq. Finally, there are those who are anxiously awaited, such as in the China Sea around Taiwan, while we monitor the days of the North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un. What must be remembered above all is that this year, 97 countries have seen the state of peace deteriorate within their borders. The GPI had never experienced such a counter-performance. Even worse, 108 countries have accelerated their militarization and set a new record in this area. Conflicts have claimed the lives of 162,000 people in 2023, the second heaviest toll in 30 years. The wars in Ukraine and Gaza are responsible for 3/4 of the victims, with 83,000 deaths recorded last year between Ukraine and Russia, and at least 39,000 deaths in Gaza, including more than 14,000 children and 1,200 victims in Israel, all recorded between October 7th, 2023 and July 1st. Finally, the GPI counts 110 million people displaced to save their lives. Between urgent care, disruption of production or supply chains, and regional upheavals, he estimates the global economic impact of violence at $19,100 billion, or 13.5% of the planet's GDP. These wars have changed the economy, but also the face of diplomacy, the real one. With a big D long considered an art of which France was also the best practitioner, the discipline is now limited to the negotiation of humanitarian coups and the creation of shelters rather than the real search for peace solutions. As for showing your muscles, it is not very advisable when the stability of the world has never been so threatened. Each new conflict divides humanity a little more and calls on historical international organizations for more cohesion to limit the gap that is widening between the Western Bloc and the rest of the planet, and ultimately raises fears of a general conflagration because of MAD, or insurance of mutual destruction. I told you about it in this video. It is this extreme deterrence system set up by the nuclear powers and which guarantees that the slightest atomic bomb launched, even by mistake, will immediately trigger the launch of all those held by the attacked camp. We have never accumulated so much military equipment, skilled soldiers, and atomic power, even during the Cold War, the war that changed everything. The main conflicts, The conflict that changed everything was that between Russia and Ukraine, the premises of which appeared as early as 2014. Since 2022 and the Russian special operation, the United States and the European Union have been making a common front and showing themselves united as never before behind Ukraine. Together, they have provided more than 200 billion euros in financial assistance in 2 years, and unleashed bursts of sanctions against Russia and those who want to work with it. But an unpleasant surprise. The countries that sided with the West were fewer than expected, and many preferred the prudence of neutrality. In the end, the Western reaction, which was supposed to isolate Russia and bring its economy to its knees, had perverse effects. It caused an energy crisis in Europe, tightened the ties that unite the superpowers of the East and the South, and gave China a great opportunity to launch a massive attack on the US dollar. Recently, the fighting has shifted partly to Russian territory, in a desperate attempt to trigger a new global awareness. Although Ukraine may have received the equivalent of its GDP in international aid, it still lacks weapons and men to stand up to its invading neighbor. And defeat is now envisaged by the Zelensky clan. Envisaged and feared, according to Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal, a Russian victory would sound the beginning of a Third World War, because it would leave the field free for Moscow to invade Poland. An alarmist scenario already announced by Volodymyr Zelensky last year, and based on threats made in 2014 by Moscow to Kiev. Alarmist but absurd, because Russia seeks above all to restore a buffer zone between its borders and those of the NATO countries. The other most divisive conflict of the moment is the one between Israel and Hamas, and which is largely paid for by civilians. Once again, it is necessary to choose a side, and this time it is a little more delicate, because Israel has been a historical partner of the West since the partition of Palestine in 1948. In the West, it's hard not to support her. We recognize his right to defend himself, but we are embarrassed by the disproportionate response that has fallen on Palestinian civilians. In the Middle East, support for Gaza quickly showed itself, but it remained timid. To oppose Israel is to support Hamas and its Iranian ally, and therefore terrorism, and there is no room for nuance. Recently, Israel exported the war to Iran and Lebanon, with Prime Minister Netanyahu's promise to destroy Hamas to the last man. The escalation continues, and no negotiations or peace plans have even been mentioned. On August 7th, the United States called on Iran not to carry out its threats of retaliation, while recalling the total American commitment to the Israeli partner. Iran, which does not request any authorization to use its right to defend itself, has promised a large-scale response without specifying which, and inaction would be considered a vow of weakness. I'm not telling you the mood. About 2,300 kilometers away, in the south of the Arabian Peninsula, Yemen is entangled in a civil war that began in 2004 and which remained ignored by the media for several years. The Yemeni armed forces are supported by a coalition of Arab countries led by Saudi Arabia in their war against the Houthi rebels of the Revolutionary Committee of Shiite Muslims who feel ignored by the Sunni majority power and supported by Hezbollah, Iran, and North Korea. In this war, the United States has long provided intelligence and logistical support to the Yemeni government in place. But faced with the humanitarian disaster and the disruptions in the Red Sea, Joe Biden announced the end of aid to the coalition in February 2021 and promised the reception of more refugees. But weapons and military equipment continue to flow in from the West, from Great Britain, Germany, Spain, Switzerland, Italy, or France, for example. Today, the Houthis are considered impossible to overthrow. They control 25% of the territory, including the capital, and 2/3 of the population who are suffering from famine, lack of water, the collapse of public order, cholera, and the absence of humanitarian aid. The Houthis continue to carry out attacks in the Red Sea, and there is still no solution in sight. Less sensitive on the European continent, the conflagration of Central Africa nevertheless causes thousands of victims. Cameroon, Central African Republic, Burkina Faso, Somalia, Niger, Ethiopia, Sudan, Mali, Zambia, Mozambique, Congo. They are all at war. Civil war, war against terrorist groups, war for natural resources, war against the climate emergency. The toll is dramatic, but the hundreds of thousands of victims from Africa are overshadowed by the economic and political interests of the world's superpowers involved in the wars in Ukraine or in the Middle East. Major conflicts that could lead to general chaos if they were to degenerate. So we watch them like milk on fire, and we anticipate the others as best we can, while China buys and stores food, raw materials, and metals by turns. There is one who is already occupying all the thoughts of the whole world. It has not yet begun, but its possible consequences are already causing shivers. This is the Taiwan file. Designated in 2019 by the famous newspaper The Economist as the most dangerous place in the world, that year, the People's Republic of China promised the return of Taiwan before 2025. According to experts, there is a real risk that Chinese action will lead to a third world war. Either Taiwan kindly gets back into the ranks and agrees to become Chinese again, in which case everything should be fine. Either Beijing will take the island by force. In the first case, it would mean that the most beautiful factories for the production of semiconductors and other advanced electronic equipment financed by American capital would pass under Chinese control, difficult for the United States to accept. In the second case, the Chinese army will have to confront that of the United States, which has granted Taiwan military protection since 1974. The first missile that reaches the island, Chinese or not, America would have to commit its army to defend it, which would mean going to war with China, and no one wants to witness that. The impact of the U.S. elections. Now let's talk about the next candidates in the U.S. elections. What do they plan to do with the wars if they are elected? Let's start with Ukraine. In the Democratic clan, it is very likely that the candidate Kamala Harris will continue Joe Biden's policy, namely military and financial support until the Russian defeat or a peace agreement, a commitment renewed during her speech at the peace summit held last June in Switzerland, without China and without Russia. In the Republican clan, Donald Trump surprised the world by promising the end of this war, which is expensive and brings nothing to the country in less than 24 hours. No one yet knows exactly how he intends to do this, but it seems that he would put pressure on Kiev to permanently abandon the Donbass and Crimea regions to the great satisfaction of Russia. Would Ukraine have any chance of surviving without American help? Not obvious. Making agreements is Donald Trump's secret weapon, and this is also what he plans to do for Taiwan. He displays a position quite far from that of the opposing side. Interviewed by Bloomberg on June 25th, he expressed doubts about the commitment of the United States to defend the island in the event of a Chinese attack. He suggests that Taiwan's defense will depend above all on its economic interest in the United States. Trump compares his country to an insurance company that should guarantee the safety of its client without ever receiving any premium in exchange, and working for free is not his type. No one knows motto, America first. He also criticized Taiwan's dominance in the semiconductor sector and is already planning massive subsidies for the relocation of factories to American soil. He seems so relaxed on the subject that some fear that he already has an idea in the back of his head, such as using Taiwan's future as a bargaining chip in an economic agreement with China. For its part, the Democratic clan is for the maintenance of the status quo and the defense of the archipelago, but not for its independence. In 2022, Kamala Harris announced that the United States would continue to move forward and act fearlessly throughout Asia, including in Taiwan, while declaring Chinese attempts to seize control of shipping routes in the China Sea illegal and irresponsible. In fact, the Biden government is still selling weapons to Taiwan so that it can prepare and defend itself, but a new step was taken a year ago when an initial grant of $80 million was paid to Taipei. Beijing's reaction made Washington understand the importance of avoiding new provocations, a directive that the Democratic clan is now trying to follow. Finally, both candidates support Israel in its war against Hamas, but here too, everyone has their own way. Donald Trump is in favor of intensifying the fighting in order, I quote him, to quickly return to normality. Israel will be protected, Iran bankrupt, and the terrorists hunted down. He remains insensitive to the protests that are shaking American universities and ignores the criticism that is being raised in the face of the terrifying humanitarian record. Criticisms that Democrats are hearing more and more, but which will probably not change the outcome. Whoever the future president is, Israel will be able to count on American support as always. As for Yemen, it will take a Trump in power to continue the war against the rebels. The Houthis were officially designated as a terrorist group by Trump himself just before the end of his last term and blacklisted. A sad decision that led to the end of humanitarian assistance there and which also proved that all blows against Iran were permissible. There is no question of stopping on such a good way. In the other camp, there is less interest in this conflict, and several attempts have been made to block financial aid paid to the coalition, but without success. The elections could therefore also turn everything upside down. Conclusion. In summary, with Trump, Ukraine surrenders, Taiwan manages, and Israel crushes its enemy. And by ricochet, Iran leaves, even if it means raising all of Palestine or Yemen. With Harris, Ukraine continues to fight, Taiwan is well protected in case Beijing uses force, Yemen is abandoned, and aid will continue to reach Israel. Now, which of these candidates do you think could lead the world to a more global conflagration? And with what conflict will the efforts of international organizations such as the UN or the European Union be sufficient to contain the escalation of violence that is hitting our planet, limit the appetites of the autocrats, correct American mistakes, and avoid a third world war? I am really looking forward to reading your impressions and getting to know your opinion on the issue. We will also make an appointment on your favorite social network to continue the discussion and follow live the evolution of events. If you liked this video, remember to leave a like, share it, or subscribe. And it remains for me to say thank you for your loyalty and take care of yourself. See you soon on Money Vision.